Okay, well, hey, maybe we'll get started. Good to see everybody, lots of familiar faces. Thank you for being here. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is part of our now weekly meetup series. This is something we used to do once a month in person, and times have changed. So we're now meeting on a weekly basis, and we're doing more meetups focusing on research. And so this week we're going to be hearing from a couple different people, but two different projects. So our first project is a TDI based project in collaboration with Business Oregon and Swinnerton Builders, and a former associate of Hacker Architects, that's Alex Zelaya, who is now finishing up his MBA at UBC, right, Alex?
Yep.
University of British Columbia. So Alex is going to be our primary speaker for that project, along with William. They will both be speaking to that project. And our second project will be discussed by a professor at Oregon State, Lech Mazinski. He's professor in the Department of Wood Science, and he's going to be talking about a former project related to surveying global CLT manufacturing. So trends in CLT manufacturing at international scale, and I think future plans for similar project, basically kind of an update to that project. So thank you to everyone for being here. And with no further ado, I'm just going to hand it off to you, Alex, to kick off your guys' talk. And for anyone who isn't familiar, we'll save Q&A for the end of our presentations. So there we go.
Yeah, I think I'll let William kick us off here.
You know, I'm going to just do a brief intro, and Alex is really going to take the meat of the discussion. But we were really excited to have Alex be able to spend his summer with us and really spearhead what is going to be a really tremendous report that's going to be coming out soon on the mass timber supply chain, and really is Oregon focus, and I'll let Alex talk a little bit more about that as we get into it. But Ian McDonald, who I don't think was able to join us today, as he and I were able to meet with Alex and a small advisory group to provide guidance and input and really connect to resources. But a really important part of that small advisory group was Jill Miles and Donna Green-Salter from Business Oregon, who were tremendous at really connecting to the full dimension of the resources and contributors to the report. So a big thanks to them and all of the folks who chimed in on it. And the idea of this report was really to have a solid piece of information that we could then guide further focused studies from. And so it was great to have that all assembled in one place. And the report timing, I think we're looking closer to the end of the year, probably, as when Ian's able to rejoin and help with that. So with no further ado, Alex, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, William. I'm going to share my screen here. And yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining today. On your Thursday. Great to see some familiar faces here. I wish we could be doing this in person, but yeah, we'll make the most of it here. Maybe someone just give me an okay, say that you can see what I'm seeing here.
Currently a black screen, but my internet is pretty bad today.
Yeah, I'm getting a black screen as well.
Got it.
Yeah, and it popped up here, but
okay,
not in display mode yet. Not in presentation mode, I mean.
Full screen. Look good?
Still a black screen over on this end. Might be casting to the wrong monitor or something, I don't know.
Yeah, that might be it here. All right.
There we go. Maybe.
We're going to keep it in this format. I think that'll be just enough. As long as you guys can see the PDF, that should be good. So yeah, thank you again for joining here. I want to echo Williams's remarks here and thanking Jill, Donna, the folks over at Swinnerton, everyone who really contributed to this effort. It was such an experience getting to reach out to everyone within the supply chain. And so, yeah, so today we're going to cover a brief overview of the contents that we looked at. And so, especially with both of our discussions today with myself and Lek, really talking about like, why are we talking about supply chain? I think that's an important point to hit here. When we think of supply chain, you know, sometimes supply chain management is considered at, you know, at a firm level as a specific company. And those two main things that you want to do is really optimize efficiency, is reduce your costs, make everything go smoother, make things go faster, and also maximize value. But for these two projects, we're looking at really industries. And so the supply chain of the industry, mass timber within Oregon, mass timber within the globe, really understanding that this is a whole ecosystem of many, many different companies working together, and that it's really going to take each and every one of us working together to really make sure it's running smoothly and to maximize the return on our investment. And so I'm a pretty visual person. I've nerd out on maps, and I figured that'd be a good start to get into what the supply chain is within Oregon. And so this is just a map of showing the many different species within Oregon. Different colors represent different species. I won't go into all of them, but I think the really important point here is talking about Douglas fir. Douglas fir is really the prime material that we use in mass timber. We can definitely use other species, but for Oregon in particular, even putting mass timber aside, Douglas fir is a super strong wood species in terms of its strength to weight ratio. And that's been a huge bump for the state. We export a ton of 2x4 studs, 2x6 studs throughout the state. And when we talk about mass timber and we want to make the premium product, Douglas fir is one of the primary ingredients to do so. And so looking at where that's situated within the state, I think is important, because when we look at where manufacturing facilities within the state are located, we have a huge concentration to where that supply is. So it's really, you know, basic rule of thumb is if you're a sawmill, if you're a veneer mill, you're looking to source your wood within 100 miles to 150 miles. And that's really due to transportation costs, which are very expensive. And so you don't want to be trucking wood from all the way across state. And so that's what's led to the 75 sawmills that we have within the state and where they're located. And I think what's also important to recognize here is that in terms of transportation, the I-5 corridor is key. And all these are concentrated along that corridor. And that's not just to move products from forest to mill to those projects being built, but it's also access to markets that we have around us, including the Washington, Seattle market that we have to the north, and then the market that we have to California to the south. And so these are really geographic, per se, like highlights that the state has. And these aren't really things that we've fully designed, you could say. But I wanted to also look at the strengths that we have as a state and reflect on what we have that's going really well and the things that we have designed for, the things we have done. And I think just looking back and, you know, seeing that Oregon, the state of Oregon has really created some of the most breakthrough projects with having adopted the TallWood Building Code in 2018, being one of the first states to do so, having taken breakthrough projects such as Carbon 12 here to really, which is, you know, tallest CLT building within the states still, and really taking a step there in terms of leadership. We've also have the manufacturers within the state here, just highlighting, you know, DR Johnson that we have in Riddle, Oregon, and Freres Plywood in Lyons. And these are, you know, being the first certified CLT producer within the state, being the first producer of mass plywood panels. And in total, we have, if we include CLT, mass plywood, LVL, and glulam, we have 12 manufacturers already in the state, which is the most compared to other states. And so we're doing really well. Biggest exporter of plywood, biggest exporter of softwood lumber consistently. In addition, what we have is strong research institutions such as TDI and such as OSU, U of O, and we have many of you that are on the phone right now, doing some really critical research and breakthrough projects within the state. And the image that we see on the right is, a picture from the International Mass Timber Conference that has happened consistently in Portland for the past 4 years, and it will continue to do so next year if we have meetings in person. But that's just to show that we are a hub of knowledge. The projects that you guys are working on, designing, building, developing, those projects are what is making Oregon a key place to be. And so those are our strengths. As we look at where we are, how can mass timber manufacturing be an opportunity for Oregon? And that's really what the scope of this project is leveraging the network of TallWood Design Institute, and then the power that the Business Oregon, the economic development team of the state, where is the best place that we can be investing our money to achieve the highest impact. And so what the process looked like was really focusing on, and what I was involved with mostly is conducting primary research in the forms of phone calls, interviews, virtual meetings with the many manufacturers that we have in the state, and hearing from them firsthand, what are the key barriers that we have within the supply chain? What are their perceived challenges day in and day out, and how we can make those better? And then hearing those and taking account of those and developing and designing strategic initiatives where Business Oregon and the state of Oregon then consider where's the best way to invest as we move forward, as we progress farther. And so I'm going to cover the top barriers that we looked at, and there's 6 of them that we'll take a look at here. The first one, equipment and facility costs. There's no doubt that mass timber manufacturing is a super capital intensive production. And so this chart here is really talking about the purchased equipment cost, and that's just purchased equipment costs if you're a sawmill already sawing logs, already drying lumber. So these numbers do not account for the drying of lumber, but going from lumber preparation to finger jointing and already down to panel pressing for CLT, your base investment cost for a small scale provider that's doing 20 million board feet, which is more or less equivalent to DR Johnson, is about $13.5 million. And that's a big sizable chunk of money just for your equipment. If you're looking at large scale, which is something more akin to like Katerra, $21 million for a base, not including the many automation and machinery that's involved to get the lumber to here, you're looking at a significant investment. In terms of facility costs, you could, just to upgrade your facility to be this, you're looking at a 4 to 5 multiplier on these numbers. And so while it is common for sawmills to invest $1 to $2 million a year in upgrading their facilities, these are sizable investments that are shying manufacturers away from actually jumping into mass timber. When we look at supply of wood fiber, this was a really big issue for suppliers, and especially this summer, before the rise in lumber prices that we saw, accessing that fiber and getting fiber at a reasonable cost for them to keep producing was a big issue. And one thing I think we commonly look at, but tend to maybe miss is that our forests, only a third of that timberland is owned by private companies, but they account for over 3/4 of the harvest. And so right now what we have is this imbalance of ownership and harvest. And so federal land, which owns more of it, is not harvesting that much. And I think this was just a sentiment that was resounding from many manufacturers spoken with. If that we can lower that fiber cost and access more fiber, then there could be a way to alleviate more costs on their end. Supply of lumber, which is a little bit different than wood fiber, but the lumber, which accounts for a significant portion of manufacturing inputs to the system, with over half the cost for raw material, and specifically dry lumber. And when we think of mass timber manufacturing, there's really 4 key components. Its species, its size, its thickness, and its moisture content. And moisture content, getting your standard 2x4 is going to be dry to a 19% moisture content. Glulam, it's going to be 16, and for CLT, it's going to be 12%. And so really that's not very common within the industry. And what we heard from many people who are either looking at this or doing it right now is getting that lumber for an affordable price is a big issue. There's only a few companies that are doing this, and companies need to pay a premium. And so getting more kilns is actually seen as a big problem within the state. The fourth, or I think we're on 5 here, but labor retainage and recruitment. A lot of companies were dealing with declines in available workforce, not just people in the area to source from, but also in terms of there's much more high-tech equipment with mass timber manufacturing, and recruiting people from places like Portland to say Roseburg or Grants Pass is actually becoming a bigger issue for people to do so. This graph is really showing the trends that we've seen within Oregon for the past 34 years is that high-tech industry has definitely grown. Forest sector hasn't. And so getting people actually in those positions is becoming quite hard. And so what can we do for that? Knowledge gap. There was a big knowledge gap in terms of suppliers. So, in the state, we have a lot of smaller scale producers. In terms of smaller scale, I'm talking about 100 million board feet, which is not as big as the many larger companies that we have. And when asked what's stopping you is many companies were just fine making 2x studs. Many companies just wanted to stay small, stay nimble, and not really make the significant investment to get into CLT. And so is there an education process? Is there a way that we can help manufacturers get more knowledgeable about this manufacturing process? And then lastly, just talking about market adoption. With COVID aside, we know that's been a really big shock to the system, and knowing that there's a lot of uncertainty with that, but looking more long-term as to where we are in terms of the adoption curve of mass timber, many companies were hesitant to say that this is a big enough market for them to jump into. And I think everyone on this call is really adamant about moving that and changing that perception. But we have to acknowledge that in terms of where we are in terms of this technology adoption, we're pretty early adopters. The industry is pretty young. And so I just show this graph to show the projects that were started in construction, not counting the many that were in design, but the projects that were in construction in Washington, Oregon, and California since 2013. And that's only 87 projects. It's not a lot. It's not a lot compared to all the projects that are being built. And so really acknowledging that we're still pretty young within this industry. And so just talking about the strategic initiatives, we had 4 main initiatives that we had separate initiatives within those sectors. And so I'm going to briefly talk about the 4 and what we looked at. The first was, how do we encourage more business growth and use the levers that Business Oregon has in terms of stimulating the economy. And we're proposing ways in terms of getting more private capital. Maybe it's less public capital, more private capital, and getting that to more entrepreneurs who are looking to make a difference within industry. Are there small grant programs that maybe they're public-private partnerships or nonprofit organizations that could pursue small grants to actually get manufacturing up off the ground? And then lastly, looking at how tax incentives might be structured in the long term to actually alleviate some of the cost barriers that manufacturers are seeing. The second was really adjusting the labor retention and how to educate the market, and looking at workforce and starting with education. And that if we can start by educating and work at recruitment from an early age, that would actually help younger people, especially in high school, be knowledgeable about and more aware of the technology that actually exists within the mass timber technology industry. It's not the old sawing of logs that might have been used to. There's a lot of technology and a lot of computer programming applied to the industry. We looked at scholarship programs in terms of how to get rural communities more access to the education that in hopes of actually spurring more innovation within rural areas. And then lastly, we're in a virtual world, having more virtual training modules that people have access to, and it can actually be learning how to use a CNC machine when that CNC machine is 100 miles away. The third was about policy and how we looked at mainly 2 ways of how to shape public policy that's backed by scientific research. and focused on two things. One was an embodied carbon building policy standard. So this would begin with pilot programs that would actually look at, we've done a lot for operational savings in buildings, but how can we look at embodied carbon for buildings? And starting with a few pilot projects, public projects, that would actually develop more public projects that to have more focus on more embodied carbon friendly aspects. And then looking at how we manage our forests, and specifically in federal forests, and letting corporations or organizations such as forest collaboratives or A to Z forest stewardship models or habitat conservation plans actually lead how we can access more fiber into the market. And the last one we looked at was around innovation. And it's hard to look at innovation and think about innovation in a time that in a crisis that we are right now, but it's really the mindset we need to be thinking is thinking more long-term and thinking, where's Oregon going to be 10 years down the road? And so focusing on innovation from the standpoint is that this is something that's already been happening within the, just a few weeks ago, the Mass Timber Consortium is being launched in terms of welcoming private companies in terms of doing applied research that can help move the industry forward. And then in terms of manufacturing centers, how could we actually look at where manufacturing centers for mass timber, where they have shared resource, shared machines to actually be positioned to help smaller companies who maybe can't afford the capital investment just yet to actually start producing. And then lastly, looking at entrepreneurship programs, specifically towards groups that are underserved. How can we empower more BIPOC communities to actually get involved and spur on more innovation within the supply chain? And so there's a lot more detail within the report, but I think zooming back out to where we started, and that's how I'd like to end here, is really talking about how the mass timber supply chain is really an ecosystem, and that every company within it, we're going to need to be working together. The next great CLT building will not be great and will not be built unless we have close relationship and are boosting up rural economies, and we need to be taking care of our natural forests. And so, as mentioned, the report goes into a lot more detail here, but I urge you to all to keep this conversation going. When this report goes out, please take a copy, take a read through it, and really we can help move this industry forward, because really Oregon has all the components that it needs to succeed. We just need to put those components together. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to Evan here. And yes, appreciate any comments and questions after Lex's discussion.
Great, thanks, Alex. Yeah, we'll go straight into Lex's presentation and we'll do Q&A after the fact. So Lex, if you are, we'll hand the camera to you.
Let's start from basics. Can you hear me?
Yes. You're.
Can you see my screen?
Wi-Fi bars or... Yeah, we see.
Okay. Can you see my screen now when I switch to presentation mode?
Yep.
This sounds like a Verizon commercial. Yes, we can still see the screen here.
Okay, so speaking about, by the way, Alex, great presentation, and I took some notes, and we'll have some discussion points after this. Perhaps I will be able to respond to some of these discussion points during this this presentation. I put the title on this already. What is the impact of the pandemic on the mass timber panels? But this starts with our knowledge of what the mass timber panel or CLT industry is right now. So this is a effort that is being funded through TDI, but ARS program, and in part also through USDA Forest Service program, and then by various partners who made possible my field trips or translations or contacts with some entities. So this is where it comes from. So what is the first thing that is taking our breath away is looking at these large panels that CLT and other mass timber panels are, the size, the weight, and the embedded cost in each panels. But actually the more important thing than the size is that the size gives this panel certain properties that are unique and that we did not see in forest products, in construction materials coming from forest product industry before. An example of such unique properties would be rather unique fire performance of these mass timber panels. The other unique thing is that the industry has evolved in a way that for the first time, we are seeing a branch of forest products industry that declines to become a commodity. It's not just production of the panels. The industry resembles Industry 4.0, and not because it wanted it to be that way, but because it was forced in this place. Again, by the sheer size of the panels and the difficulty of just cutting them to size on the construction site, and the difficulty of conceptualizing how they may be used in construction in an effective way, and how you can design with those, and all the peculiarities. So this size, so to speak, that we started with, forced a very unique industrial product, that the product is essentially a building, and the panel is just one stage in the production of this final product. And it's not going to become commodity. None of the panels is going to be pressed until the design is finished, and none design would be good until the designers, the architects, the civil engineers contact and talk to the manufacturers. So this builds a very peculiar supply or value chain, if you will. And finally, this is a technology that, if used right, can produce, can build at unprecedented pace very quickly. So this is image of a Moray Row building in London, the first of its kind, right? The first tallest CLT building in the world, built at a whooping pace of 1 week per story. Similar to this one in Melbourne a couple of years later, was built like just 4 days per story. And that's quite something. Again, that's a unique thing. And this is again possible only because of a tight collaboration between the architects who design it that way, engineers who design it that way, manufacturers that make panels to the specs, and then the contractors who know what kind of material they work with and know how to put the building together that way and at this pace. Now, what is remarkable, it allows us to build not only the tallest buildings, but also the largest timber buildings. So this one in here, Dalston Lane in London again, it's not the tallest mass timber building. It's the largest in terms of the mass of timber being used. It's about 3,000 or close to 4,000 cubic meters of CLT being used in this building. Perhaps this record has been already broken. And it's again a technology, I would insist, not just a product, right? That enables modular approach to construction in a way that has not been possible before, in a way that does not necessitate to move entire volumetric models on highways, right? And just putting them in as a stack of Lego pieces. But you can move these models and construct them quickly on site and build out of this. Now, if you thought this is a future or just concept, here's a picture from a company in Sweden, who makes 3D furnished models made of CLT and puts them in buildings in large quantities. Now, the industry grows at exponential rate, more or less, which is quite amazing. And the previous depression did not make a big dent in this trend. Now, sorry, I lost my the annual output currently that we could document for 2019, I mean, strictly document where we know the number, is about 1.4 million of cubic meters a year. But we estimate that it may have been much closer to 1.8 million, including the information that is shaky and harder to document, or based on production lines that we know of as existent, but we don't know any number for them. So what we projected at the beginning of the year for 2020 was 2.5 million of cubic meters a year. Now, this should be put in perspective, and Alex made this point already. This is still a boutique industry, right? It's in its, I wouldn't say nativity any longer. It's not a baby industry, but it's toddler, okay? It's toddler industry who does not compare in size even to other forest products industries, and even less to the other construction industries like steel or concrete when you take them in the total. So this is something that needs to be kept in mind. Now, the global landscape becomes complicated. I keep adding dots on this map virtually every month, right? To the point that it's much easier to speak about it in terms of regions rather than individual manufacturers. This also comes along with some sensitivities of manufacturers whom we interview or whom we survey. And not everybody is comfortable with their specific data attached to a company being published. So this is our way of going around it, okay? So we will live with this regions rather than countries and stuff. And this would be number of manufacturers, again, as counted at the end of 2019, by number of plants, by region. So this dark blue part would be just the Central Europe here. We refer to this as Alpine region or DAC. The Holtz Courier, who is one of our favorite data source for this region, would include Czech Republic in this. God knows why, they're far from Alps. But the rest of Europe would just have about 13 lines included. Compared to this, North America would be 7 lines, right? But 7 lines, this should be put in perspective. 7 lines active right now and producing structural CLT. There are at least 2 lines, at least 3 lines on the continent that produce exclusively access mats, non-structural CLT. Now, things look different when you look at the annual output of these plants, and you see now how dominant the Central Europe still is in terms of the CLT output being produced, which means that you are more likely than not to see a CLT, if you see a CLT that is produced in Europe, in Central Europe, right? The rest of Europe is pretty much like North America in terms of the global output, right? Even with smaller number of plants. And there's Pacific, Africa. We still did not have data on South America when we put together these graphs. Now, when you look at the capacity, per shift capacity, actually there are large plants being built in North America. It's just that they are still not up to the speed with saturating this capacity, with adding shifts and making them work as fast as the European companies are. Now, this is not just, again, this is not a commodity industry. So this is not just a matter of warming up and oiling the machinery and running faster than yesterday. Actually, the reason or the key to saturating the capacity is the input, and that is a project acquisition. And the project acquisition actually goes through architects. And this is why I would argue that architect companies are the entry of the supply chain for this industry. Okay, so think about it that way. Now, gauging the market is notoriously difficult. If you remember the first time you've heard about these two items, it was about the same time, right? Can you recognize them? Hope you do, right? And now both of them essentially catered to something that wasn't needed. Nobody needed smartphone. Nobody even knew that they need a smartphone or Segway. There was no way to gauge the market because there was no need for this, right? Similar thing is with CLT. Now, how can you predict which of those? Both of those were promised to change our lives forever, right? Now, one of them famously, just a couple of weeks ago, went under and declared, that's not us, sorry, we couldn't make it, right? And it wasn't iPhone, right? So it's very hard to predict at this stage of development of this industry, which of these paths the mass timber panel is going to be, although we root for CLT to be like iPhone, right? So we were devising ways of predicting what would be the conditions conducive to a success of this. And we came up with some metrics that can be focused on and measured for regions, again, in terms of potential environment for thriving mass timber panel production. And that would be softwood production in this region. If there is no softwood production, it's hard to imagine a successful mass timber production, right? There has to be like certain level of development and industrialization, and this would be represented a little bit or as a proxy by a certain GDP level. And these are, as they are for now, rather expensive projects. Then population. I mean, you may have rich countries, sparsely populated, and they would not have such a need for construction. And then it's going to be much harder to squeeze such a white unicorn as CLT in this thing, and so on. Land area, a number of CLT lines would be like compared in here. So this is how we construct this thing. Everything is going to be compared to USA, right? So USA would be like blob of the area of one, and then we compare the other countries, the rest or the regions, rest of North America, Alpine Europe, other countries in Europe, Pacific region, that would be like Asia Pacific, right? Including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And Africa, which has budding CLT production. South America is not included in here. So how it goes further, I'm clicking and okay. Here it is how, if you look at the softwood production, it looks like even, right? By USA, Alpine Europe, the rest of Europe, and the Pacific region. GDP actually would make like first good parity between the USA and North America. Land area, okay. Sorry, in Europe, land area, well, Europe would look very small in here. But when you look at the number of CLT lines, right, like huge disproportion. Where does it come from? So, okay, perhaps this population would tip us a little bit off. So if we do it per capita, all of this per capita, right? So this is, and then again, USA be counted as one. And we look at the number of lines per capita in the US, it could have been like 14 times more if we imagine, if we compare ourselves now with the Alpine Europe, the population density, the GDP, the softwood production, right? This would be the environment in which the mass timber production can thrive. The CLT output volume per capita could have been like 16 times more in North America or in the States than it is right now. Okay, so this is how we look at it. There are 4 lines in the US right now producing structural CLT, could have been 56. And it would be the level of saturation that you see in Alpine Europe. Now, is it a prediction? No. This is just saying what the potential in the region is, right? Are these metrics perfect? No, they are not. We can refine them and see there are circumstances that modify and mitigate all of these predictions. So we were on our merry way with these predictions, right? And at the threshold of 2020, everything looked rosy and nice, and then this happened, right? So I don't need to explain anything more in this. So our predictions became even less certain. I mean, we would like to have the crystal ball, but we don't. But then again, there is history, right? This kind of things happened before. If you ask economists, they actually have seen this thing happening before. In the medieval plague, the rich people became richer, poor poorer, right? Then in 1500s, another thing, even at the beginning of the previous century, right? So it's not like we are in complete unknown. There are things that we can start ask for intelligently. And then we also have some database on the industry. We observe its trends, and we can ask intelligent questions to these companies to see how they fare and try to figure out how they may fare in the post-pandemic new normal. This effort is funded modestly, I should say, 20,000 for 12 months through the TDI. And the fund is augmented somewhat by USDA Forest Service. And these are the questions that we are trying to answer. Is this industry positioned to win this kind of struggle? I mean, again, the special product orientation for now may actually be a winner. The fact that the rich become richer while the poor become poorer actually makes this industry that caters for now to the richer part of the population make it fare pretty well through this pandemic. Is it nice? No, it's not nice, but it's at least a prediction that make us think that this industry may survive quite well. It is positioned to build these white unicorns, right? The special products, something that richer segments of the population can afford, or richer communities can afford. The next question would be, what about this diversity? Is it going to be a plus or minus? So the first aspect of the diversity is large versus small. And you would see that most of the CLT companies are actually small, even though they do not contribute this largest number of volume to the market. Now, how likely is it that any crisis is going to kill all of them, or is going to affect the same way the small and the large? I mean, I would say that the diversity, just like in evolution, is a strategy, natural strategy for survival. Some segment of the industry is bound to survive, is bound to be better positioned to fare through these dire straits. Well, the size comes at a price, right? But it's possible. Now, local versus global may be the same, right? Is this pandemic going to affect the same way companies that are the global actors, like the companies in Austria that built in Australia, right? Well, pandemic definitely affects the long distance operations. Is it going to affect the same way local operators? We don't know. Now, automation versus manual labor. Most of these plants, particularly the new plants, these are very sophisticated machines, integrated machines. So this is the high-tech meeting forest industry, right? Referring to Alex's slide, right? Jobs going well in high-tech and low in industry. But this is the peculiar intersection where high-tech is meeting the forest products. Now, are the companies relying on manual labor are going to be affected the same way as the highly automated companies? Open question, right? But at least we are wise enough to ask this question. The question of the supply chain. So on the left, you would see like typical supply chain or value chain for commodity-oriented forest products. Now for CLT, it's much more complicated. And again, it starts with architects here. Do you see my mouse? No? Okay, very good. So it starts with architects as the entry for the entire industry, right? This is the project acquisition and goes through engineering, design, and CLT project management, and forestry and primary processing may be part of this transportation, the manufacturing of the hardware, construction, right? All of this becomes part of the supply chain. Now, because of the history of the industry, it so happened that many companies are actually vertically integrated along the supply chain. Are there weak spots in there that are going to be more affected than others by this pandemic? Is it going to change the scheme, the way in which the companies are integrating, or in which how they use the supply chain? It's an open question again, right? So this is one thing that I mentioned, the global actors. Is this going to be still possible with all of this restriction for movement? Or would the movement of projects be as restricted as movement of humans, right? Another open question. So this is what we would like to know. And finally, is so far the industry benefited from great attention of the public as the potential solution for the future, green technology, right? And it benefited from many public orders for this. The communities made statement that way. We are for the green future, so we are not shy to spend more to build in our community a building like this, being this a new school, new parking lot, new community center, new city hall, right? All kind of projects like this. Is this kind of statement, are the communities that are now affected by the pandemic be still interested that way in CLT technology? Or perhaps should the industry try to help them perceive itself as the part of the solution? So the picture here shows you this famous Wuhan hospital, right? Put up within weeks, modular structure. Now, could CLT industry be perceived as one that is capable of pulling out projects like this, of delivering affordable housing in communities affected by pandemic, by a fire, by floods, by wars? Okay, can the industry be seen as part of the solution? It's a good question for the future of the industry in the new normal. And finally, something about predicting the future. I like a Pythian quality of this one. I'll give you a minute to read this title. This is coming from Timber Online or the Holz Courier. And just read the title and the rhetoric of the title. Corona is not going not stop CLT. What does it mean? Isn't perfect? And the explanation is equally nice. So far, cross-laminated timber sector came through the corona crisis with a black eye. It sounds like an achievement, right? Or is it not? Okay, this just brings home predicting future is quite difficult, right? You know what this is. It's Delphi Oracle, who was famous from giving statement about the future. They were as clear as these titles in the Holtz Courier that I've just shown you. So summing up what I just presented to you with, we are trying to find out clues about the future, but we have no illusion that we can predict it. We can see and we may find out what may be the future, what may be the new environment that may support the development of the industry and help it to move it into bright future. But this is not going to be written in stone, and it's not going to become a prediction that you can go by. It's just clues. Okay, let's discuss. Thank you.
Thanks, Lek. Great. You know, it's funny in that presentation, it really stood out to me. You had this this slide with, I guess, the Spanish flu. It was a couple women with masks on, but they weren't covering their noses.
Yeah.
And funny what you see now. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. At this point, we'll open it up to questions. We have a few in the chat, and I have a few of my own, but I'll let anybody that wants to ask one outright go for it if they have one. So yeah, if you have a question, please field it now. Otherwise, I'll start going to the chat box.
So if the audience is shy, I may just start with some comments to Alex's presentation. This was great, no mistake. But you mentioned that, and this is a common statement made here in the region, that Douglas fir, the prime best fiber that you can find, is a best resource for CLT. Actually, this is a misconception. CLT has been created as a way of utilization of lower quality lumber. Douglas fir is almost like too good for it. And we spend a lot of forest product money, forest service money into finding out how we can utilize lower value lumber in CLT. This is engineered products. So essentially the art is in predicting what are going to be the properties of the panels when you use whatever in it. But once you have some faith in the process of predicting, you can use forever or whatever, right? And
exactly. Yeah.
you come up with predictable products. So this is one thing. The other thing I have in here, on the small companies sitting on the fence. Actually, the industry is quite diverse. There are small actors acting within this alpine region, just next to the largest companies in the world. And I have never seen yet a company being killed just for being too small. There is niche for small companies in this industry. So I'll stop at this.
I think that's a really good point, Lek, to bring up, is one, the low value timber. It's something we definitely looked at, you know, speaking with you and everyone at OSU who's actually doing research on this topic. We have a ton of different species within the state that's not Douglas fir, and ponderosa pine being one of the big species that we have east of the Cascades that could be used. It shows it's a little bit of a weaker species, but that's what cross-laminator does, is allows you to use different species within that. And I think we're just young within that research so far. And I think that OSU is actually doing some work to actually prove that wrong, because you can actually make this more of a composite product. One thing that we've, you know, also hit is it's really kind of, what do you start with? And Douglas fir being just the popular product that is highly valued within the wood, basically basic building construction industry, tends to be the go-to product for CLT. And also what we see is CLT, you don't have to use 2-inch thick material. You could go smaller, but that's just what we have available in terms of lamb stock. And so there is this kind of imbalance or where we need to meet in the middle in terms of, what can we make smaller lamellas to use in CLT,
Well,
and who's going to do that?
Alex, I might add a thing. If you bring back up the your PDF that had the particularly the mill locations and then the map of species.
Mhm.
I think a different way to look at it, just more longevity, is where our infrastructure and our transportation corridors are. And that's really what the study started to focus on. And so you see, just superimpose I-5 down, where it occurs on the site. And you see that corridor, you see the correlation of that and the correlation to the species. And so part of what we're talking about in present state is where our infrastructure occurs, the transportation corridor that warrants further study in order to explore the ability to take advantage of other species. And so I think it's a little bit of knowing your position, knowing where you want to be, and begin with the end in mind and see if there's an opportunity to look to how you would leverage that. I think the challenge with Ponderosa currently is the reliability and the distance of transportation to get to the mill to facilitate the next step in the process. And so I think, I agree with your statement, but I think it's a little bit about looking at, how do you give people the confidence even to work in the current corridor, but then how do you give them the confidence to take a leap of faith on an alternate species? So it's more complex, and I think Alex did a great job of kind of exploring those aspects within the report.
This is very true, but also you may notice that the Ponderosa pine and the other weaker species is actually what is being harvested on public lands as the fire prevention programs and in quantities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's looking for homes. So there as you said, there is some middle point to be found, and multiple directions to be explored in here.
Yeah, I think that's. Again, I think tip of the iceberg is what Alex kind of touched on for Oregon. There's a lot of discussion around Southern Oregon as well as what I call Northern California. But if you're in California, they call it the Oregon border. So, and taking advantage of some of the species there. And there's some significant investors that could be looking at that as well. I think your small company comment was well placed, and I think the opportunity for synergies and entry. In some ways, the dollars look big. In some ways, the dollars look small for what Alex was looking at and had up on the slide for kind of that entry barrier. So I think it comes with a little bit of confidence, and I think that's there's some great resources that will be referenced from Business Oregon that can kind of point to opportunities to leverage that and to increase our capacity. I really appreciated, Lek, your diagram that showed kind of the U.S. as a one and what Europe is versus what the line capacity of North America is, and I think that's really what those of us that are interacting with mass timber and on a deep basis nationally are looking at, and some national programs that are potentially coming forward. I think there's tremendous opportunity in the U.S. To mature that, and I think that's why the endowment and Softwood Lumber Board are pretty focused in on what is happening with mass timber.
Yeah, it's something since that's where CLT started in Europe, we're kind of following trends. And so seeing the growth that it's okay for many small companies to coexist within larger CLT producers is a good indicator of how Oregon can play within that supply chain.
Absolutely.
Hey, everybody, I got a question. I will. William, David McElnay, I oversee urban design for the city of Hillsborough. I'm also a practicing architect. And I've literally been like bounding between virtual conferences today. So I'm glad I stopped over to see you guys. And I'm having a crossover thought, which is along the lines of like when cell phones hit places like China or Africa, that technology effectively jumped over all of the restrictions that existing technologies like telephones with wires create, the friction that they create. And I think that CLT, in although it's kind of a framing device like anything else, like steel and concrete and whatnot, there's kind of an opportunity. You guys are talking about manufacturing specifically, but I'm kind of being on the bright side and saying that there's an opportunity for an integrated project delivery, that there's potentially newness and freshness in that, in CLT, in the sourcing, making, designing, project delivery, because the challenge is that it's quote unquote new, but the opportunity is that it's quote unquote new. I think over the long term, I don't know what you all think. William, I know you're in project delivery. I don't know who wants to take that question, but there you have it.
Well, I think, we've presented and talked a lot about in this group, and some of the catalyst that mass timber has provided. And I think that's something that I've been accused of preaching on a little bit relative to mass timber, is the opportunity for highly collaborative teams, because that's kind of what it's taken to get the breakthrough. And I think what is exciting is that entrepreneurial spirit, that synergy continues forward as we're now, energy and atmosphere, energy use is become a big discussion whenever we're doing a mass timber building. And so all of a sudden we're producing net zero mass timber buildings. And now we're starting to talk about buildings. And today I was in a presentation with a client and we were talking about the fourth dimension. And we were saying that we've typically framed projects around cost, schedule, and quality. And now we're talking about carbon. And I think a lot of that has come out of mass timber and sequestration and wanting to understand the carbon equation. So I appreciate, Mark Fretz's comments last week about the study that is being undertaken at U of O around carbon. And so that fourth dimension of carbon, and that's coming into the piece. So now we're talking about, low carbon buildings, carbon neutrality, carbon positive. And how does that inform how we do buildings? And so to me, that's part of why, I think CLT, iPhone, not the Segway. So that was a great analogy that Luck had up there. And I think it's that type of thing, everything from team formation and project delivery through to how we are aspiring to build better buildings. We're thinking about through wildfires, the toxins released through buildings from the 70s or 60s that burn all of a sudden. And so we're thinking about what we put in our buildings and how a healthy environment exists. And with mass timber, we talk about biophilic response. So there's so many things that are positives, I think really propel the discussion forward to have a exponential impact on our industry. I hope I answered your question, but you got me on a soapbox, so I went.
I would just add, I think, it's a great question, David. And I think when you talk about project delivery, like, yes, mass timber pretty much, in order to do it effectively, and William definitely knows this better than I do, is that you need to have the right workflow that addresses that. And we think of how COVID has changed everything in terms of everyone's own workflow, that mass timber is only going to have a big opportunity there, because we're not just bringing materials out into the field. We're actually having to design that and coordinate that well up front, which is extremely well suited for a virtual environment. And McKinsey just released a report this past summer in terms of where the construction industry is going to go in terms of COVID impact, and the opportunity for the construction industry to seize is huge within, and it's specifically within manufacturing. And so as we move for manufacturing, there's going to be more developers, more contractors, and more designers actually beginning to become more integrated. And so I think that's a trend that we're going to see, and mass timber is going to play really well into that trend.
And I would add to this that right now we are fascinated with this large, new, beautiful projects made out of CLT and mass timber that are meant as sophisticated statements of how we think about the future. But what I would like to see is this industry exploring ways of making buildings that are inexpensive, no frills, easy to deploy, easy to dismantle, move, and they may. I would not put on this a adjective cheap, because it has like bad connotations. But the thing is, it's actually expensive, and it requires much more careful design to come up with a modular system that would be versatile, inexpensive to build with, and inexpensive to deliver, and fast, rapid to deploy, than it is to develop another spectacular statement. It is not a big art of building beautiful and high with large budgets, right? It would be much more interesting and appropriate for these times right now to focus the attention on how you make this thing work for the communities, for communities particularly that have been devastated by fire, pandemic, war, floods, whatever, things that we know are coming with the global climate change. So it's like additional aspect. I mean, not only we take care of sequestering carbon, right? But now this technology is uniquely suited to address certain ills and problems in the society that we're going to observe and see. It would be nice to have a bunch of brilliant architects and engineers and manufacturers come together and start thinking how we can make it inexpensive, easy, one solution, modular solution that can work as hospitals, medical centers, community centers, affordable housing, whatever have you, whatever is needed to keep the fabric of the community intact after devastation.
And I think there'll be, I mean, it's almost like cracking the code as we go through different product types. And that's what's been kind of exciting, is not just the first aha moment, but working with teams to crack the code on different, everything from workforce housing to medical to, civic, academic. We're seeing a broader incorporation. And I think, that those also are exciting aspects of it. I think one of the things that Luck touched on there, Alex, made me think about OMIC and maybe some of the virtual training, if you could elaborate on that, because I think that's a good piece. I saw a question in the chat about training the workforce, and I think some of the virtual pieces that OMIC does and is doing for are relatable.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to give a little brief background, OMIC is the Oregon Manufacturing Innovation Center. It's in Scappoose, just a little bit short drive north of Portland. And really how that center has started is really to work with large companies, small companies, research institutions such as OSU and PCC, and really get people trained to work on these more advanced milling machines, which are, it's focused specifically on metals manufacturing. And so, but still very transferable into the wood products industry. And so for companies who are looking to train themselves on these new CNC machines, arc weld cutters, they can do that here in this one facility. And so having a shared facility that people can basically pay a fee to participate in, to conduct research and development, as well as for people to educate themselves in terms of how to use these more complex, I would say, but almost in the metals industry, very well adopted compared to the wood industry. And so in terms of OMIC, I think that's a good example to look at how we could apply that to mass timber manufacturing, how we could potentially look to constructing a center that brings people together and actually educates the industry as a whole more collaboratively.
Yeah, and they're achieving a lot through virtual training on the equipment so that you can develop the skill sets in an interactive way that works with kind of next generation workforce. And then also, then it's almost like you can get, essentially your finishing school is practical application, but it's a tremendous resource. So looks like Luck has, I love the diagram. So Luck.
So this is a comment on what you just said. You may notice that I placed the education and training as a piece fitting into this supply or value chain of this industry. Sorry, I have to respond. Halo? Teraz jestem w trakcie dyskusji. Cześć. Sorry, otherwise it would come, keep calling. So you see that the education and training being part of the supply or value chain. Anecdotally, leaders of the most progressive parts of the industry told me that the CEO levels, the management levels, spend as much as 50% of the time, high-paid time, educating their own cadre, their own workforce, educating the clients, educating communities, educating people along the supply chain. It is a costly element of this entire enterprise, apparently, right? If your management has to spend about 50% of the time educating people about it, it's very different from just advertising. This is new. You cannot relate it quite well to anything that has been before.
Like this dovetails well into a question from Greg House, specifically asking about what kind of skill sets are needed to successfully operate mass timber manufacturing facilities from the perspective of a more mature European industry. So this kind of dovetails well into what you're talking about here.
Thank you, Greg, for the question. And Greg asked this question because he's the best person to actually to respond. He planted this question in my mind years ago when he was presenting a seminar at OSU. I don't know if I probably had been thinking about CLT already, but it first dawned onto me that this requires a lot of skill sets that are currently absent in the forest products industry. And machinists, the designers and engineers who can work with this within the same BIM platform, right? Contractors that can use the same sophisticated way of communication of ideas, so to speak, right? All of this is missing in this industry. The people who are being trained that way are being sucked by industries who offer greater money to automotive, aerospace industries, and so on. So it's not only about creating opportunities to provide this kind of training at a cost that would be acceptable to people who aspire for this kind of careers in rural places or in this interface between rural urban where the CLT or the mass timber panel industry positions itself right now, right? But also provided to them where they are in a way that does not require them to take a degree to get trained for the job. Let's say challenge, but also an opportunity. Many of these skills can be taught online using virtual reality, augmented reality. And it's something that we here at OSU have developed a proposal for USDA, and we hope it's going to be funded, right? Using these advanced teaching tools to teach or train people towards this skill badly needed in this industry at a cost that will not require them to pay their debts by joining aerospace industry or automotive or high paying actors.
And I think that's an important thing to recognize, is that a lot of the manufacturing facilities tend to be rural. They're closer to where the forests are that harvest the wood. And that's some of what we started to look at is, and like the OMIC model for the aspect of kind of this virtual reality, augmented reality, because that's in Scappoose and you're in Roseburg. It's, you know, if you've got to travel to get training and certification, that's a challenge. And so it's how do you bridge distance to continue to develop that workforce. As Alex also depicted there, it's kind of a grassroots approach where you're starting kind of at the, you know, junior high and high school, and say that you don't have to leave LeGrand or Grants Pass to get a good job. You don't have to go to, you know, there's alternative paths for those that aren't suited to academia. And so it's really developing our skilled workforce. That's something we're facing in construction, you know, every year that goes by, with folks leaving the industry, and every down cycle, you know, leaving in droves. And so it's really then when the market cycles back up, you know, having a skilled workforce to put work in place, it's a similar challenge. So anyway, a lot of discussion there.
If we look at metrics and comparing ourselves to Central Europe, where the industry thrives, one of the elements that I could not put on my graphs because I don't have good metrics is the professional training. Germany, Austria, Switzerland have phenomenal system of professional training, taking people out of high school or even having professional profiled high schools that train this kind of high level professional skills without necessity of obtaining a college diploma for this. It's dispersed, is connected with apprenticeship with companies. It enjoys a great industrial support, funding from the state, from local regions, from federal states. Germany is a federal state just like US, right? So there are different levels of providing for this kind of education. But this infrastructure for such education is hard to find in here. Community colleges are serving in part some of these functions, but it cannot compare to the system that is in place currently in these countries that started the CLT. Perhaps Greg would like to add to this. Greg has enormous knowledge about it and does a lot along these lines. The asker of this question. You know Greg House, Cut My Timber and stuff, right?
Yeah, I don't know if Greg is here ready to jump in, but I actually have a question that kind of dovetails a little bit and is related to Cut My Timber. You know, so like you spoke to CLT and mass timber as sort of a non-commodity. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about vertical integration in companies related to manufacturing, fabrication, you know, design, so on and so forth. And kind of taking a sidestep here, Alex, one of your first slides, you showed that in terms of startup cost, the panel finishing equipment was one of the most substantial startup costs. So, you know, anything related to fabrication, it was something like 30, 40, maybe even 50% of the equipment startup. So I was wondering if some of the separation we're seeing in Portland, for example, with companies like Cut My Timber and Souder Timber that are just exclusively doing fabrication, is there a model in which companies that are just producing, just manufacturing panels are capable of just really doing that sort of baseline manufacturing and then working with fabricators? And William, I should add, Swinnerton is doing fabrication as well now. So I'm wondering, is there like, does that give some kind of like nimbleness to the industry and also kind of make startup easier for companies that just wanted to get into manufacturing but not invest in fabrication startup?
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think I'll just answer by saying that I think there's room for both. The integrated model approach, I think I could name 5 companies in the Pacific Northwest that are trying to do everything from the basic design to actually turnkey construction. But then what you have on the other side is companies like Greg's and Cut My Timber and Souder Timber that is focusing exclusively on CNC panel production and large beams. So you have more of a niche market, but kind of what Lek and we all kind of discussed is in terms of market adoption, there needs to be a market for all those companies to exist. And I would say that there is. I think that there is a niche for, if some company just wants to focus on CNCing of panels, there is an opportunity to do so, as long as it makes sense from a cost standpoint, delivering those panels from the site to those places to be fabricated. I think there is an opportunity to do that in terms of where it's geographically located, because like is showing, these panels are huge. And so if we can do that closer to sources, that might actually be a more strategic approach in terms of lowering costs.
So I'm not an economist, so it's harder for me to say what makes economical sense, what doesn't. I may just speak from evidence, and I have yet to see a CLT or mass timber producing company that could afford not having a CNC center on premises. DR Johnson, in their first concept, they wanted to do just this, and sending their panels to Greg to Cut My Timber to be processed. But now this is already almost like 300 miles of for the panel to go to be processed. And now if they are making, if they are doing projects in California, right, you have to have this 300 miles back and then down to whatever place you have. It becomes enormously costly proposition. Even moving these panels around within the facility is a challenge, right? It's like internal logistics of the manufacturing plant. So even more moving them at a cost, because then again, another cost item in here is just moving this large item on the highway, right? It's oversized. So when you ask me, I would say it does not make sense to build a CLT manufacturing plant without CNC. Does it make sense for the processing center to exist? Yes, because at times, again, this is not a commodity product. The production does not happen at certain pace throughout the year. It just goes in like overflows when you have large project, and then it goes into under capacity on other days. So on these overflow times, there will be space for Cut My Timbers to process, or companies like Cut My Timbers, right, to process the overflow. And they are still very viable for items that are much easier to transport, like glulam, like other large items that are not just two-dimensional, but one-dimensional large noodles, okay? Does it make sense to you guys?
Yeah, I think we try to simplify it down of don't ship air, don't ship waste, right? And so, so there's definitely synergy having it close to the manufacturing to be able to fabricate. But part of what we've seen is constraints in detailing and fabrication, aside from manufacturing. And so there's capacity for manufacturing and really better understanding the overall supply chain and vertical integration, or at least sort of knowledge of how it's vertically integrated, is super key to be able to overcome bottlenecks in that approach. So if things are getting hung up in fabrication, to be able to know where you can move that fabrication to deliver a project schedule is super important, given the speed with which the buildings can go up if you can understand that supply chain.
So I would say where it makes greatest sense would be large urban agglomerations, not even like one large city, right? But something like LA or area between LA and San Francisco, right? Where you have a cluster of manufacturers and then a smaller these processors that can count on a constant flow of overflow from one of these manufacturers, right, to process, and just plain processing of noodle elements like the glue lamps in between, right? But the business to be viable has to have something to do all the time, right? And the processing centers have will not be masters of the business flow, so to speak, because the projects are being acquired through the architect offices to the CLT manufacturing plants, right? And then only then the processor gets some business out of this at times.
So quite honestly, sometimes, I mean, what we're finding on projects is CLT starts to be the easy piece. It's the glue lam and the fabrication of the glue lam that really starts to become the bottleneck. And so I think it's really looking holistically at the frame to address those. And it takes a different kind of strategic planning than what contractors are often called to. And so that's, that takes a commitment of resources, a commitment of the right skill sets.
Okay, guys, I'm gonna call it here. We're at 5:30, so I'm sorry to interrupt a live and very active conversation, but I want to thank William and Alex and Lek for presenting and taking the time to join us and share their thoughts. So thank you three very much. Excellent presentations. We can do our emoji round of applause since we can't be in person. And I would like to share a few things. First, Adrian Kaiser from U.S. Forest Service mentioned that people should look into applying for wood innovation grants. So if you look back through the chat, you'll see what she mentioned. And this actually speaks to a meetup we'll be having on November 12th. We'll be hearing from Lek again, in addition to a number of companies specific to wood innovation grants on small diameter, restoration, low value species, that sort of stuff. So just wanted to bring that up. I will post the recording of this meetup shortly. And I had a question for William and Alex specific to the report. Do you guys have an idea of when that will be available?
Yeah, I would just offer to this group at this point, probably towards the end of the year. Okay. There's some additional steps that we want to take in the process.
Great. Well, do you guys have any last thoughts, William, Alex, Lek, you want to share before we sign off?
Thanks for showing up. Thanks for everyone participating, and hopefully we can keep this conversation going.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think I can speak for Alex and William and Ivan if you have any questions or comments that come to you after that. All comments, all feedback makes our projects better. So keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun working with Alex and Jill and Donna and Ian on putting this together, and another layer to the work that we all enjoy and why we come together. And I just love meetups because we get to see all of our friends who are similarly passionate about this. So
I gotta say, this was the most meetup that a virtual meetup has felt yet. You guys really brought the thunder on the discussion. So yeah, I felt like I was there in person again. All right, everybody. Well, I hope you guys have a great night, and hopefully see you soon next week, to be specific. Hopefully we'll see you there.
take care.
All right.
Take
Bye,
care.
everybody.